In this presentation, we will be looking at styling arguments. Our main areas of focus will be word choice, sentence structure, punctuation, and what we call the special effects, which are figurative language. First of all, we have style and word choice. And the most important thing to understand here is that for your academic or college papers, most of the time you're going to be using a professional style or a formal style. One of the basic things that this means is that you want to avoid contractions, don't instead of do not, that kind of thing. You don't want your writing to sound like speech. I always tell my students writing and speaking are very similar in many ways, but they're also very different. Also, for college essays, you want to avoid the pronoun I. It's something that we simply do not do or we try to avoid when we're writing college or academic essays. At the same time, you want to avoid technical language or jargon because some of your readers are not going to understand technical words and you don't want to scare them away. And finally, you want to be aware of the connotation of words. As you may know, words have a denotation and the connotation. The denotation is basically the definition that you can find in a dictionary. So it'll tell you what the word means, literally. The connotation are the associations that the word may provoke in some readers. So be aware of what words connote or what they symbolize, because your readers will think of those things naturally. Moving on to sentence structure and arguments, you want to go always for variety. And two areas in which you want to explore variety and put it to practice are sentence structure and sentence length. Short sentences are punchy, right? They're straight to the point. They can be very effective, but you don't want your paper to have or to be composed all of short sentences because it's going to sound choppy, right? Longer sentences, on the other hand, are going to draw your reader into the statements as they try to follow that long sentence and to make sense of it. So combining these two will give you a great effect. The good thing about medium length sentences is that they can be used for anything pretty much. They're whatever you want them to be, right? So they are multi-purpose. Balanced or parallel sentences establish relationships between the things that you're talking about in those sentences. And something you always want to do, at least at first, is to avoid fragments when you're writing your academic or college essays. Now, there is a way to use fragments effectively, and this comes with practice. Most of the time, when I'm grading papers and I see fragments, they are not used in an effective way. They are simply incomplete sentences. So using fragments in your academic essays is a skill. You can master it. It's not difficult, but at first, at least, try to avoid that. Punctuation is very important, as you know. It marks the rhythm of sentences and of paragraphs and of texts. So here we have just a few comments on some of the more, you know, confusing elements of punctuation. For instance, semicolons. What they do is to mark a pause that is stronger than a comma but less strong than a period. So it's something in the middle between those two. And the reason why I mention this is because I see that many of my students confuse semicolons with colons. They use them interchangeably. Sometimes that can be done depending on what you're trying to say, depending on your sentence structure. But most of the time, a semicolon is a pause, whereas a colon is a pointer. Something that follows a colon may be a list of important things or just one thing, but it's one thing that you want your reader to pay attention to. So that's the difference between those two. Dashes, some writers use these. They are very useful. They are like colons, but as you can see here in the example, they grab your attention a little bit more. They call attention to themselves. And when you use two of them paired, as in the example that you can see, what they do is to highlight the information that you include between them. So technically, when you have two dashes like this, you can continue reading the sentence and the sentence will make sense if you take away the statement between the dashes, just like with parentheses. But the difference with parentheses is that this is important information. Parentheses imply that the information there is kind of added, right? Whereas two dashes are saying, look at this because this is important. Another punctuation mark are the ellipsis dots. And these can do many things, but two things that they can do that are important are to leave the sentence open, sort of leaving your reader with that thought, or indicating a pause if they are between two important sentences in the same paragraph. Finally, you want to become familiar with all of these, and you want to learn how to use them, but you do not want to overdo the use of any of them. Okay? Semicolons, dashes, I remember the moment when I learned how to use them and I was like using them all over the place. That's not a good idea. So once you know how to use them sparingly. Figurative language is what we might call the special effects of your writing. And there are two types. The first one is tropes. They involve a change in the ordinary meaning of a word or phrase. We're going to see what that means. And the other type of figurative language are schemes, which involve a special arrangement of the words. So tropes deal with meaning, schemes deal with arrangement. In the following slide, I'm going to give you some examples of some of the most important tropes and some of the most important schemes. There are many of them. So you might want to take notes of the information that we're going to find on the next slide. Okay, so as you can see, there are several tropes, a few schemes here to look at. Some of them you already know what they mean. For instance, we're going to start with allusion. An allusion, as you know, is a reference. That's all there is to it. It could be a literary reference. You could be making reference to a work of Shakespeare or something like that. But there are also popular references. Now, with popular references, you want to be careful. You want to know your audience. For instance, in a speech or in a text, you may be making reference to, I don't know, a rapper that you listen to. If your audience is the same age as you, they will probably all get the reference and it will be a success. But if I am your audience, I will have no idea what you're talking about because that's not the kind of music that I listen to. So just an example of how that may work. Moving on to analogy, this is basically a comparison. You know what an analogy is. For instance, when you say that life is like a race, if you stop to catch a breath, you will lose the race. That's an analogy, right? Antonomasia, this means substituting a descriptive phrase for a proper name. That sounds complicated, but it's not. You may have heard of Elvis Presley being referred to as the king, Michael Jackson being referred to as the king of pop, right? So if you say the king of pop, and you continue the sentence, people will know who you're talking about. Superman is the man of steel, right? So that's what antonomasia means. Hyperbole, as you might know, is simply an exaggeration or an overstatement. If I ask you, for instance, have you seen all 75 of the Avengers movies? You know there are not 75 Avengers movies, but there are so many of them that it seems as if they were 75. So that would be an example of hyperbole. You are also familiar with the concept of irony, in which the meaning conveyed is in tension or in opposition to the literal meaning of the words or the phrases. And this could be situational. It could be, literary if you're writing a text. But as an example, a professor could give you a paper that Johnny wrote. And they're saying Johnny is such an excellent writer, as you can see in this paper. And the irony, which the professor doesn't catch, is that Actually, it was Johnny's cousin who wrote the paper. So the big irony there is that Johnny is not so much a wonderful writer. It's just that, somebody else wrote the paper for him, which is wrong, by the way. Don't do it. Metaphor. You probably know this one also. A metaphor is a comparison, right? But it's a direct comparison. We're going to see, the contrast between metaphor and simile in a while. If I say to teach is to act, as if I were an actor, right? I am using a metaphor because I'm comparing the two actions here. A metonymy is a device by which a particular object stands for a general concept. What do I mean by this? You have heard the phrase, this job puts bread on the table, right? Puts bread on the table. It doesn't mean that it puts literally bread on the table, right? It just means that it allows you to make a living. So that is a metonymy. Bread would be a metonymy for, um, you know, being able to support yourself. An oxymoron, we have a paradox or contradiction. Okay, some ready-made phrases use this device. Your book gives you the example of quote unquote negative economic growth. If it's growth, how can it be negative, right? But if you say negative economic growth, it sounds a lot better than saying economic decline or economic collapse or something like that. So those are examples of this figurative language device. You know what rhetorical questions are? They're not meant to be answered. That's basically a definition of a rhetorical question. For instance, would that not be fair for everyone? Let's say you're talking about free college tuition for everybody. Would that not be fair for everybody? The answer is not expected, right? It's kind of implied in the question itself. Signifying is very complicated. I can't really give you an example here because it involves dialogue. So I refer you to your book. There are examples there of signifying. What it means is, and I give you the definition from the book here, when you cleverly and often humorously needle another person. Okay, and as I said, I cannot give you an example because I would have to do dialogue, and I'm not going to talk to myself here. I already do that too much. So please go to your book and look for examples of this one. This one is not as effective or as applicable to one of your papers. So that's just something to keep in mind. We mentioned simile in contrast to metaphor. It's pretty much a simile is pretty much the same as a metaphor, but you're going to use the word like. So a metaphor that I gave you, to teach is to act. If I translate that to a simile, it would be teaching is like acting, right? And you can probably tell the difference. When I add like, it kind of implies that yes, it's very much like acting, but there are differences too, right? Whereas a metaphor, to teach is to act, that implies that they're almost the same thing, right? So that is the main difference between metaphor and simile. And of course, you know what an understatement is. A quiet message to make a point, right? We live in a time of overstatement. Everything is excellent, everything is epic, right? But understatement can be very effective too. You could say something like, 100 is a grade I can live with. That would be an understatement, right? It's a fantastic grade. It's a wonderful grade. But you're saying it in a different way, maybe a more interesting way to say it, right? 100 is a grade I can live with. So moving on to schemes. The first one we have is anaphora, an effective repetition. The best example, which you have probably heard, is from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream. At one point he says, let freedom ring. And he repeats that in the following sentence and the one after that 3 times. Let freedom ring, let freedom ring. And that makes the point, right? So it's a very effective device. You don't want to overdo it either. You want to make sure that what you're repeating is really important. Antithesis is the use of parallel words or sentence structures to highlight contrasts or opposition. That sounds complicated as a definition, but look at this example from Neil Armstrong. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Okay, so antithesis. You have parallel sentence structures. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And they are contrasting the two different things that we have here involved in this case in a single event or act. Inverted word order, as the name implies, is basically the way Yoda speaks, right? Many people use it. Sometimes you have heard the phrase, rarely do we see, I don't know, people walking backwards, right? Rarely do we see, instead of saying we rarely see people walking backwards. It's just a device that you can use. And finally, we have parallelism, which is the use of grammatically similar phrases or clauses. And one of the common examples for this is the beginning of Charles Dickens' novel, Hard Times, I think it is. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So parallelism, you have parallel structure, but you're also making a difference there. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Once again, something that you can consider when you are producing texts. All of these are devices that will help you to convey your message. Some of them are more common than others. With all of them, as I said before, of punctuation, you want to be sparing in the use of them. You do not want to charge your texts with these devices, but be aware that many times they're going to be useful, and in those cases, you can definitely try to apply them.